Forward. Forward. 40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up the thrust. Forward.
You've reached After the Paracast with Gene Steinberg and Christopher O'Brien.
On After the Paracast, we always have a different point of view to present. Sometimes it's just a wrap-up of the show. We give you our reactions, talk about anything under the sun. Sometimes the show continues. And guess what? On this week's episode of After the Paracast, the show continues. The things we couldn't talk about, the questions we couldn't answer from listeners. We've got Goggs Mackay, we've got Paul Kimball until a meeting draws him away, and Greg Bishop with Gene and Chris. Chris, maybe the best way to start this is we had questions that couldn't be asked, and maybe now look up a couple of those questions and let's have them asked.
Very good. I think the other half of Ravensfee, her questions, has to do with the role of podcasts. And she says podcasts now seem to be one of the most influential formats when it comes to covering the paranormal or the strange. What are the benefits and limits of this medium? And what would you like to see more and less of in the paranormal podcast world? That's a very appropriate question, I think, for this show. Gene, why don't you start out? You were kind of the visionary behind one of the longest running paranormal podcasts we have. How have you seen the development of this particular medium? And do you think we need more or less in this completely inundated podcast world?
I started the Tech Night Owl Live before there was such a thing as a podcast in October of 2002. So we're talking about nearly 14 years of that show. And we had an online radio network called Mac Radio. That went nowhere. I mean, I eventually left it because I couldn't persuade my fellow podcasters or broadcasters to do the level of promotion I thought was necessary to actually get kind of an audience. So I went out on my own about the time that Apple introduced the podcast feature of iTunes. And it was a way for anyone with an online radio show to get publicity, to get featured, and we got featured a few times in iTunes, and a way for people to just go to one place and get all the episodes of the show they wanted. And this was certainly a new way of doing radio because I come out of traditional broadcasting. Back in the late 60s, I was working at regular radio stations, and I did that for 10 or 15 years before I drifted off into another business. But this was a way of embracing radio, but in a way that was more freeform. There were no controls. There were no rules. We were making it up as we went along. And then in 2006, when we had the opportunity to do the Paracast, it was the same thing, basically creating new rules. Now, right now, we are a hybrid show. As our listeners know, we're on almost 24 traditional radio stations via GCN. So we have this very formalized timing structure with ads. That's why the ad breaks have to be where they are, because we have a calendar that we watch. I have a little chart here that I check off, and it's like a log where each segment has to be timed within 1/10 of a second. Don't ask me how he put that together. So in a sense, I feel that I was a pioneer in this business, and what this has also meant is that radio itself has changed. In the early 2000s, we had the advent of satellite radio, where it's kind of like cable TV for radio, but gave you the opportunity. It was primarily for truck drivers originally, where you can drive anywhere in the U.S., and now I guess it's in Canada and possibly in South America, and hear the same show, not go from one station to the next and have it drift back and forth as you got within their range, you got out of their range. For different exceptions where they don't have repeaters in local areas or in tunnels, satellite radio worked everywhere. But online, it doesn't matter. You could just download the show to your gadget. It could be an iPhone. It could be an Android phone. It could be a Mac or a PC or whatever, and hear radio shows. And it gives the opportunity for people who never had a chance, like bloggers, to express themselves verbally to do so. So in a sense, therefore, I've been sort of a pioneer. Who else wants to jump in on this? Paul Kimball.
Yeah, to me, it's just a method of technology that allows you to spread information and communication. So it's just the evolution. My business, somebody's about to transfer just completed 2 days ago. We just completed the final day of post-production on my most recent feature film, and they're going to email the entire thing to me, well, through Hightail, which is it's 8 gigabytes of data that I'll be able to use as an online screener. It won't be the complete super high resolution 4K version, which I don't think you could send through space email. But, everything's getting more complicated. Technology is allowing us, it's kind of like we haven't seen something like this. You can find them in human history, the Gutenberg Bible, the printing press, that era, probably the telegraph, and then the telephone. And it's moving exponentially, but it still comes down to content. So no matter what camera I shoot a film on, or that, like now you shoot on RED and 4K, and it used to be people would shoot on film, it doesn't matter. It still comes down to story. So it still comes down to the information, which is the difference between good podcasts and bad podcasts. There's far more of the latter than there are the former, because you need a series of things. Not good hosts, you need consistency, and frankly, you need good guests and people who are capable of interacting with the hosts and also sort of the audience in a roundabout way. And if I was to say one thing in answer to that question, I have seen some podcasts do this, and I kind of like the fact that the Paracast does this, where you have gone and brought in people like Goggs who were listeners. Now, I don't think Goggs is an experiencer of any high strangeness, but bringing listeners in is a good thing. It takes, from that pyramid model where you're talking down to people and you're engaging them in the conversation. I think bringing more direct experiencers, people who have high strangeness experiences themselves, onto shows is a good thing as well. And I think you're seeing more and more of that as time goes on. So I've tried to do that myself whenever I do interview people. I always find it's great to talk to Stan Friedman and those guys, the interpreters, the tellers of stories. But I sort of always prefer talking to people who had, and in the Ghost series we did this, we would talk to people who had direct experiences. And those were the more interesting stories because you're getting them from the source. I think the really good podcasts try and involve as many of those people as possible, as well as trying to involve their listening audience in as many ways as possible.
That's why we have over 240,000 messages on the Paracast forums, because we've involved our listeners. Goggs.
Yeah, Gene, it's often decried in the ufology field that the average age of conference attendees is, constantly rising, and it's going to be, there are few young people turning up at conferences and stuff. But that's just a reflection, I think, in how people in general these days consume content of media. I'm sure we all remember the kind of time when people started to get box sets, of The Sopranos or 24 or whatever, and watch, DVDs and TV programs in that way. It was a kind of stepping stone before we could just get Netflix and stuff online. And I think the way things need to go, in addition to podcasts, basically, I think really we, maybe 10, 20 years from now, we can almost forget many of the physical conferences where people have to travel, get a hotel for the night, and be in the audience. More the kind of conference is probably a more suitable idea for this day and age, where all the speakers are online and you pay your money to log in and be involved in a conference in that way. Podcasts, just like everything else in this kind of instant gratification culture, a podcast allows the consumer of the content to listen to it when and where they choose. And in the past, TV, before video recorders and radio and stuff, you had to sit down and watch a TV program or go and see a movie or listen to your radio program at a certain time, usually at home. All that has changed. Podcasts are kind of at the forefront of that. It was the time when people start to say, hey, I want this, I want this, I want this. I'm going to have it on my MP3 player and I'll listen to it when I like, going to work, at work, whatever. So I think podcasts are great. They're here to stay. I love the fact the Paracast has reached out to, it's had several listeners on as guests. You know, it really does involve its forum members and listeners. I think it's been, you know, the best at that in terms of the paranormal podcasts out there. We just have to accept that, certainly for ufology, that things are changing and the way that people will interact. I don't believe there's a great problem with not enough young people being interested, because if you look at the number of videos, the ones that we hope are real, that are being uploaded to YouTube and various sites, you know, it does seem that there are quite a lot of young people getting involved in ufology and being excited about it. It's just that they don't end up as bums on seats at the standard kind of conference. They consume and get involved in different ways, and podcasts, the Paracasts, we're in the right position for these type of people, and we just need to keep going in that direction where there are the people interested, the younger people out there, but the way they get involved is very different than the way people did 20, 30 years ago. And as long as everyone accepts that change and is involved with it, I don't think ufology has a problem in longevity.
You know, I absolutely agree, Goggs. I think we need to flow with the times, embrace the technology. I think podcasts are an excellent way to expose people to personalities in the field. Obviously, a lot of the people that we have on the Paracast will only come on the Paracast because they have a new book out, for instance. So some of the guests that other podcasts get are a little sketchy. I think there's a lot of, I think Paul mentioned that there's a lot of podcasts out there that really aren't worth the amount of time that you're going to have to spend to slog through some of the ineptitude and lesser quality guests. That's one thing about the Paracast. We do tend to have a higher level of, or a higher standard for guests. But one thing I must say, I understand that the butts in the seat conferences are probably going to be extinct like a dinosaur at some point in the not too distant future. But boy, I'll tell you, I finally got to meet my paranormal, strangeness, weirdness, ufological idol, and that was Jacques Vallée. Not only did I get a chance to meet him, I actually got a chance to sit down and talk with him a little bit. And I would not have been able to do that if it was a virtual conference. And I have a bucket list of people that I'd really like to meet and at least talk to a little bit. And Jacques Vallée was at the top of that list. So I know Greg will probably echo my sentiments. It was really, it was awesome to see him humble, open, accommodating. He gave everybody who approached him personal, intense, connection and conversation. And he was just elegant and made himself available. He didn't hide in his hotel room. He was sitting in the conference room just like everybody else. I was absolutely impressed and amazed. And that kind of experience, I think, meeting somebody that means so much to you in the way that you think, the way that you research, the way that you filter information. For me, meeting Jacques Vallée was really important. I can die ufologically a happy man.
Now, Jacques Vallée is one thing, too. He towers over you because he's very tall.
Yeah, he is. He's 6'5", I think. He's
something like that. By the way, we were talking last week about his age. He's 76. Okay.
Really? Okay, so he's not as old as I thought. That's good. Maybe he has another couple of books in him. I really sense, and I don't know, Greg, maybe you want to comment on this. I really felt that he looked comfortable. He did not look uncomfortable. And of course, this, for some of our listeners who are not aware, this would be, I'm pretty sure, his first public UFO conference since 1989. And he swore he'd never do another one. He was very upset about being booed off the stage at International MUFON. But I saw a very gracious, very accommodating, and a sincere person. He did not hide. He did not walk around like, oh, I'm Jacques Vallée and they make movies about me and you're not. Not at all. He was the exact opposite of that. What'd you take away from Vallée's appearance? And also Douglas Trumbull, too, the effects wizard who did Close Encounters, Blade Runner, 2001. Got a chance to talk to him, too. And he's trying to hijack my Kincaid Cave project, which we can talk about in a future episode. He's totally gung-ho.
Well, have him on to talk about it.
Yeah, well, I think I will. Had a great time meeting him. And again, Douglas Trumbull was, he was like a little accountant. You'd never know that this guy has, I don't know how many patents, several movies that he was asked to do special effects for. He had to actually design and invent equipment to pull off what, Spielberg wanted, what Kubrick wanted, etc. Ridley Scott. So that's one thing, Goggs, that you will not get from a virtual conference is that shaking the hand, getting the picture taken, sitting down, talking for a few minutes, bouncing ideas around, that sort of thing is much more difficult, I think, if you don't have that butts in the seat sort of scenario. I'm sad that it's going to be a thing of the past, but we have to forge into the future. What do you think about Vallée, Greg?
I thought the same thing you did. I talked to him for a little bit. I took a book for him to sign. He talked to me and Miguel RPJ for a while. Not a long while, but probably as much as anybody else. I asked him some questions, and he was very gracious and forthcoming with answers. So, and I'd met him before. I'd met him twice before and gotten to talk to him alone a couple of times. But the funny thing is when I do get to talk to him, it's like the first time again, and I turn into a stupid fanboy, and I try not to be an idiot. But like you said, he was really nice about it. You know what I noticed that was kind of depressed me? They announced him at the banquet, and about a third of the people stood up. It's like, Jacques Vallée's here. I can't believe Alejandro pointed him out, which was nice. Rojas, the guy that running right. The show.
The MC, yeah.
MC.
And there was a scattering applause,
and about a third of the people stood up. And
you and I were sitting there just hooting and hollering. And...
Yeah, I don't know if I care that only a third of the people stood up, and I don't know if Vallée cared either. I think he truly does not care. All he cares about is the information, research, and innovation, and how people do that, and having serious people take things seriously. I don't think he cares if he gets a lot of people standing up and clapping for him. Because I was kind of like, oh, that was too bad. And then I thought, well, you know what? Most people aren't going to get it, so that's fine.
Right.
And that leaves more room for people that are into it and more creative in their thinking to go about it quietly, which I think is the best way to do any kind of research into this weird stuff. Do it quietly, do it intelligently, create a network, have a mentor maybe. Like maybe if Vallée, if he'll respond to you. Occasionally, I communicate with them, very occasionally. Anybody like that. I think it's a good idea. And also, that shows the two sides of the coin here. One is conferences are great because you really get to talk to people, see people, connect with people. I did not know too much about David Weatherly, who wrote Black-Eyed Kids and a few other books. And he's a very good researcher. And as I found out, he's very open to all kinds of different theories and strategies and everything. He does not stick himself in one category. And if I hadn't been in that conference, I don't think I'd ever have met him probably or connected with him. I'm glad I did.
I don't want to be a devil's advocate about conventions. Here it is. Okay, here we go. The other shoe. Okay, so we know, I don't know how many people attended the International UFO.
They had 10 to 15% more than last year, which was their record.
So what, about 1,000, 1,500 people?
About 1,500, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, a little more actually.
Maybe a little more, yeah, because the hall was full and it was more than 1,500 seats.
Okay. San Diego Comic-Con. 2014. How many people do you think showed up? Give me a figure, guys.
I don't know. 200,000.
130,000.
Okay. Well, next year it'll be 230.
I went when there were 500 people showing up when I was a teenager. Yeah, in the 70s.
And they were all dressed as Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and Spider-Man.
Well, we're going to have Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman in Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice coming up in March. But you see the floor space it occupies.
Should do that, like a soft core thing, sort of a porn thing.
Especially Wonder Woman.
Three-way, trying to get the capes out of the way,
Right, some cape action, guys. Yeah, there's a line in the movie, in the preview, where Superman says, "Is she with you?" And then Batman says back, "No, I thought she was with you."
See, that's what I'm saying. She should be with both of them, and they should totally go into a really cool sort of arty softcore thing where they're flying in the air and doing things to each other, and well, maybe not.
They're making a Wonder Woman movie, and you know who plays her boyfriend?
No, who?
Chris Pine, the guy who plays Captain
Oh,
Kirk.
really? I just loved Linda Carter's shorts. She has that wonderful thigh gap that it's so hot.
I've got a quick point about Comic-Con. I went to one a couple of years ago, and I'm not usually into the actual. I like some comic characters, but I actually just went to tag along with a friend, but. Managed to get to meet Dave Prowse, who played Darth Vader, and Lance Henriksen. So I came away from that just being very chuffed just with that. That was worth going just for that.
You can't meet these people online. It's like looking at porn online and trying to have a sex life. It just doesn't work. At least if you're a normal person. Sensuality, information, connection, all these types of things, I think we're going into a phase, I think, in culture where everybody's going to become more and more isolated, and we're going to have, everything's going to be at arm's length. And that to me is not a good thing. I think we need to retain at least some of the tactile aspects of our reality.
Well, I did too. I think that there's a place for virtual conferences too, and I think there's more of them. And I think it's a good idea because how many people can afford to travel to the place and pay for the ticket and all the, that runs into hundreds and sometimes thousands of dollars. Whereas you pay 15 or 20 or $30 or whatever and get 10 speakers or something. You just sit in front of your computer and you get to interact with them a little bit online, ask questions, all that. I think that's good, but I think both should be, there's room for both.
Now, in fairness here, the Comic-Con in San Diego occupies 11 acres of space. Paul Kimball, have you ever been to one of those things?
Comic-Con? No. They have something here in Halifax called HalCon, which is significantly smaller, but 6,000 or 7,000 people, the same kind of thing. So I gave a lecture at one a few years ago about ghosts and the ghost cases thing, and I was in the same room, so I followed on the bill after J.G. Hertzler, who played, among other things, General Martok on Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Yeah. So I got to meet him, and he was talking about how to be a Klingon, and he stuck around for a little bit. I don't know how. I wasn't paying attention. It was a packed room. But I noticed he stuck around for at least the first 10 minutes of my lecture. So there, I've talked about ghosts to Klingons, which was kind of cool. Aaron Gray was there. I think that was the year Aaron Gray was there, who played one of my childhood favorite actresses. Ooh. Played Wilma Deering on the old Buck Rogers show. So those kinds of things are good, and I agree. It's great that technology can bring people together through virtual conferences, but nothing. It's like books. E-books are great. Nothing replaces actual book. The tactile sensation of reading a book, at least for me. Online newspapers, the newspaper industry is going through a death throes, many people will tell you, because people just aren't buying newspapers anymore. And I think that's a shame if everything would someday move to online stuff. But that makes me sound like an old guy. The one thing I think you have to do is you have to create. We're in a different era, and some people will call it politically correct, and usually older white males, and complain about it. But I think we're in an era where you have to engage and be as welcoming to as many groups of people as you possibly can. And so that, creates things in terms of language and how you interact with people and the kinds of subjects and the way that you deal with them. And one of the problems that ufology has traditionally had is it's mostly men, they're mostly white, and, they're mostly older. And that is, I have heard from more than a few women in particular that I know who are interested in the subject, but have absolutely zero desire to go to conferences because they've seen some of the videos I've shot and they go, I don't see a whole lot of young women there. I don't see a whole lot of women, period. And, I've been to some of those conferences where it's like an old boys network. It's really one of the last vestiges of the 20th century kind of madmen mentality sometimes.
Yeah.
I've seen UFO researchers try and pick up women at these conferences too. I'm not going to name who they are, but it's not exactly the most welcoming atmosphere for people and some people. And I think that's something that people really need to look at. When I was at the Paracon, for instance, which was the small conference that they held here in Nova Scotia, run by women, equal number of men and women in the audience. And I think if I was to look at the speaker bill, an equal number of men, and I don't think they specifically went for gender equality, but they tried as hard as they could to be inclusive and welcoming to everyone. And I thought, well, this is great. This is like no other UFO or paranormal conference that I've been to. So that's one of the reasons why I really enjoyed it. So, I think we have to be careful about that kind of stuff, as all of us being older men. I don't know how old you are, Goggs, so I won't speak for you, but I know how old the rest of us are. And, I think I'm the youngest one of the bunch at 49. And so we're all middle-aged guys or older guys. And I think we have to be careful in terms of our languaging. We can still have fun, but we have to be as inclusive and welcoming as we can possibly be, or else we'll find that these younger people aren't coming in.
What's the demographic, say, for conferences in Latin America, say Mexico? I mean, is it more gender balanced there?
We would have gotten that answer if we talked to Red Pill Junkie. So maybe the next time we have him on, that's a question he can address. Now, it sounds to me like the way you're describing it here, older white men, and you think that's the audience for Fox News, that's the audience for Donald Trump. I don't want to be in that audience. Oh, wow.
No, you want to be in the cutting edge audience. You want to get as many different, I don't want to be in that audience either. You want to get in as many different perspectives as you can. One of the great things about co-hosting Ghost Cases with Holly is Holly was 17 years younger than me, brought a totally different perspective to life and to, just traveling and where we were than I had. And that had a pronounced effect on how I viewed things, including, I think, the experiences that we were going through. So you had a generational, some people would look at that and say you have a generational gap. I would say you have a generational opportunity to bring two people and we're, obviously one of us was a guy and one of us was a girl. So two different people, completely different life experiences into the same place and how they would view things differently. And so there was one episode in particular, I just wrote about it recently on view902.com, which is an arts, culture, and community website I edit here in Nova Scotia. And it was one of our Ghost Cases. It was allegedly haunted mansion in Nova Scotia down in Yarmouth, which is a fishing town, seaport on the eastern shore. And Holly and I were both there, and the story as it related, the ghost story was that the very male ghost, seemed to have an interest more in female guests than in male guests. And Holly, sort of, if I had been there alone, I didn't really have anything happen to me. Holly had all sorts of things happen to her, and really disturbing and upsetting things, to the point where at one point she was crying in the hallway and I had to go out. We weren't on camera. This was the night before. And, she just said, look, I need a hug, which generally you don't get from, if it was Greg and I can't imagine either one of us saying, we need a hug. But that was a really different experience to me, to just see how she reacted to this sort of experience that she was having. I think you need all of those kinds of things. It's like a stew. You need to put all that in there and really be open to that. And it's the one thing that the ghost people, I'll call them the ghost people, in my experience, are much better at than the UFO people. If you go to ghost hunting, I hate that term, ghost investigating societies, or people that are interested in that kind of stuff, I've never found barriers. Let me put it to you like that. I've never sort of looked around and said, this doesn't look like the general society as a whole. There's a bit of everybody here. I go to UFO conferences, and my experience has generally been, it looks like the Fox News audience. And that, to me, is a problem. So...
Yeah, if you talk to them, they sound like the Fox News audience, too, a lot of them.
Yeah, a lot of them.
Sadly, that's true as well. An awful lot of them sort of seem to sound like the Fox News audience as well. But, I don't know what it is, but part of it, too, I think, is the failure of UFO researchers over the years to embrace and engage with technology. And they come from a world, people like Stan, and Stan's great. He'll go there and he'll engage with people one-on-one, but it's still that top-down, very pyramidal structure of I'm the researcher and you're the audience and I'll talk to you and I'm interested in hearing what you say, but let's never forget how this works. I'm the guy that's going to be standing on stage and you're not. Not that he would ever phrase it like that. But,
but you captured a, I think, kind of an attitude that permeates throughout not only the field of the paranormal and ufology, but permeates through politics, through culture in general, art, fashion, music. You can go down the list. I mean, some are more homogenized than others, like music, but I think it's really important that people realize that, these are human beings and they get treated in a deferential way. I mean, I watched David Hatcher Childress, who, of course, been on the Ancient Alien show for years, and people walk up to him constantly and say, "Oh, you're the guy." And it's really difficult to not have that sort of impact your attitude about yourself after, several years, decades, whatever. And I think someone like Stan is very gracious and is able to handle it and not go too overboard about talking down to people. But you're right, Paul. I mean, there is this elitist sort of, I've been in this field for 50 years. You've only been in for 45. And, there is that kind of unspoken sort of hierarchical, I'm part of the A-list mentality. And kids are absolutely turned off by that. They want more of a communal experience, people sharing their experiences and not talking down to them.
Sure. You can see that particularly in politics. Why is Bernie Sanders so popular with young people? Why was Jeremy Corbyn and still is so popular in the United Kingdom with young people? And why is Donald Trump so popular? Which is really weird because he's the ultimate super billionaire plutocrat. It's because at least he can mimic the sort of I'm one of the people kind of thing. And sometimes it's real and sometimes it's not. But I think that's what people are looking for. I was taught early on there are two types of management structures, and it applies to everything that we do. One of them is the pyramid, where, the pharaoh sits at the top and then it slowly broadens out, but everyone's under him. And the other one, which I much prefer, even when I'm directing a film. I mean, I understand I'm the director. At the end of the day, I have the final say, and I've earned that right. But I make better decisions if I work in a more sort of circular structure where I'm the center of a wheel with all sorts of spokes equally coming in, and I'm pulling things in from all of them. Very short story. I actually had my production assistant, came up to me and said, one of the actors wants to talk to you. This was 15 days into the shoot, and so we were getting along great. And I said, about what? Well, he has a couple of ideas for this scene, but he's afraid, he's going to offend you. Afraid? Where is he? I want to talk to him because that's what he does. He's the actor. And so he gave me the ideas, and he said, look, I don't want to step on your toes and your vision and everything. I said, hey, my vision is your vision, mi casa, su casa. And the worst thing that I could do to you is I might not agree with your interpretation, and sometimes that was true. So he gave me 3 ideas. I accepted one. I said, that's great. Never would have thought of it. The other 2, perfectly valid ideas. I just see it differently. And he was no problem. Just thought I'd raise him. So, if he was playing baseball, that's a Hall of Fame batting average, 333. But without that, I've met directors who would say, no, I don't want to hear. This is my way or the highway. This is my vision. So weirdly enough, directing has taught me an awful lot about how to interact with people, to understand what people are good at and maybe what people aren't good at, and how you have to engage everybody from your production assistant, your craft services person, and your grip, all the way up to your stars in the process of putting something together.
And the caterer is real important too.
Nobody's more important than a caterer. I know, because they'd often go, where's Paul? And I had left set to get donuts, partly to get away from everyone for a while, but also because your film crew runs on donuts.
Candy bars.
UFO conferences don't always do that. And sometimes, I've met a lot of UFO researchers. Stan's a good one. He does engage with people. But there's an awful lot of them that are older, and they just don't do that. And it's nice to hear that Jacques Vallée did. I kind of always suspected that he would be like that. I saw Michio Kaku speak in London several years ago with Hawley, and he took questions from the audience, and then he engaged with everybody outside in the hallway afterwards. And, that's great. It's like, wow, you're Michio Kaku, one of the world's great theoretical physicists. Can I ask you about UFOs? Sure, why not? So that was, you don't get that a lot. I walked away, both Hawley and I walked away going, what a cool guy. That's what you want. You want people to walk away with that feeling.
Greg, you have something to comment about this?
Yeah, I found out really early on, and I mentioned this earlier in the show, that if somebody comes up to you, probably 90% of the time, they just want to tell you their opinion. And if you let them say that opinion and engage with them, I think that's a great thing. And then every once in a while, somebody will come up and express their opinion, and I become friends with them because it's just like, oh, wow, I never thought of it that way. Please tell me more. And I think that's a great thing, and you should never turn that down. And yeah, most of the time people come up and they just want to tell you their opinion, or they want to complain about something you said or whatever. That's fine too. I don't care.
Or they want to tell you what happened to them. They want to relate a story. I get that a lot. I know you're the right person to tell us. I've only told my wife, and I think my next door neighbor, but because he saw it too. But then they'll launch into this story, and it's like this verbiage just comes bubbling out, and who am I to say, well, I don't have time right now, and maybe talk to that guy on the other side of the room. You have to engage with people because they're opening a part of themselves that they're not willing to open up, I think, in their everyday life, and so I think there's a responsibility to the researcher, to the personality or whatever, to at least allow the person that wonderful cathartic experience,
Yeah, I said this earlier. It's like I think it's part of being able to integrate it into their life or their worldview or whatever you want to call it, so that they don't they don't go nuts. They just voicing it to somebody is probably all they needed. In a lot of cases, like I said earlier, they'll come up and tell me the story, and they'll say, "Okay, thanks," and they'll walk off. They don't want my reaction. They don't want me to tell them they were right or wrong or anything like that. They just say, thanks so much for listening. And I say, yeah, you're welcome,
those are the good ones, because then you don't have to deal with, God, in some cases, hours of interaction.
Yeah, I've had that too. I had a guy follow me out into the parking lot one time, which is a whole nother funny story.
Well, it almost reminds you of our strange story that we heard from Whitley Strieber on last week's episode. And I didn't mention Whitley during the course of our episode, but this is where he said he was talking to somebody, engaged with them in a conversation at a UFO conference, and then the guy went out and he saw the person go over to Whitley's car and spit on it.
Yeah, there's people with strong opinions. Chris, you were there when that guy at the end of Chris Rukowski's talk. He got in the line to talk to everybody for asking questions, and he says, "Why don't you agree with," I don't know who it was, David Jacobs or something like that? And he says, "Well, I just don't. I don't agree with him." It wasn't Jacobs; it was somebody else. He said, "Sorry," and the guy said, "I think it's a tragedy that you researchers can't agree with each other," or something like that. He sat down. What the hell? I think it would be horrible if they all agreed with each other.
Oh my God! It's like all the Hammers marching lockstep in a Pink Floyd video.
Well, I think that people like that come there to have their preconceptions reinforced. And if you're there to have your preconceptions reinforced, I don't know why you go to the damn thing. You might as well go to a concert or something. But I think the point of a really good conference, online or wherever, is that nobody agrees with each other, and occasionally they talk to each other about it.
Right, and
in a civilized way over a beer or something or whatever. I think that's the most wonderful thing that can happen.
Well, and the other thing is they stimulate your imagination, your objectivity. In other words, opening up new doors of thinking, new angles of introspection within the person who's listening to this. And I think that more than anything really is what's good about conferences, podcasts, iConferences. I do agree with Goggs. This is going to be a wave of the future. And I think to educate people, bring them up to speed, give them a solid foundation, that's a very good vehicle with the technology that we have now. But the conferences is different. If you are able to pull somebody aside who maybe has sparked something in your mind and has maybe opened up some doors for you, if you're able to lasso them and pull them aside and pick their brain, more power to you. And it's difficult to do that online, although, you can establish communication channels with people, remotely. So, I don't know. What do you think, Goggs? I mean, you're a perfect example of somebody who has really embraced, podcasting, and you seem to be discriminating because you've listened to every Paracast podcast, some probably twice.
I understand there's a pill for that.
Oh, well, we're going to have the red pill here. I had so much fun, Greg, with hanging out with you and Miguel, man. You guys are just, oh man, what I don't want to say power couple, but what would it be? A power partnership, boy. You guys had me second guessing my vinegar nature on several occasions. Why are you so negative? I mean, it doesn't matter. It's like, be okay with it. And I'm like, oh. It was great. Miguel, man, that guy he is a real amazing, he has incredible insight. He really does. And for someone that English is the second language, he is an incredible writer.
Yeah, he's a better writer than most people I know that his first language
he's
is
way
English.
Better than I am.
I asked him how he learned English, and he said he just learned it himself by basically watching children's programs in English, and then going up from there and just working at it. He taught himself, I guess.
Wow. I'll tell you, if there's an up and coming pundit, thinker, analyst in this field, he is way at the top of my list as being one of the more important unsung heroes in this field right now. He really is.
I think so too. And he did all the artwork for my book, because
I wanted to bring that up. I can't wait for It Defies Language: Essays on UFOs and Other Weirdness, which is a book that Greg is coming out with, and Miguel has done the wonderful artwork. I'm looking at the cover artwork that's like the Pascagoula monster meets Robot Monster meets Robbie the Robot, kind of being beamed down by a saucer.
It looks like a 1950s science fiction movie poster, which at first I went, huh? And I thought, that's exactly what it should be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, well, tell us about it.
He's a polymath.
You know what? Let's give Goggs a chance here. We talked about him, and now he's in the third person.
Yeah.
Goggs?
What was the question?
What should researchers be doing, at conventions, and how they interact with people, and this question about, I'm the researcher and you're not, and how those kind of barriers are breaking
the pyramid
down.
Hierarchical structure that Paul mentioned.
Well, I think there are researchers out there who, they do elevate themselves and project down, as in, you listen to me, I am the expert, this kind of thing. And there are other people who are, more than happy to have a back and forth. They don't pretend to have all the answers and stuff. To be honest, because I haven't actually been to a UFO/paranormal conference, I would actually love to see the dynamic of, like after hours, of who mixes with the great unwashed masses, and who doesn't, and who sets themselves apart and keeps themselves to themselves. I mean, it sounds like, just as Chris was describing about how Jacques Vallée, who, let's face it, he hasn't been a regular face at UFO conferences for a long time, and we can understand why, because he sees the drivel that just does nothing for the subject. But I'd love to experience what the dynamic is about which researchers kind of set themselves above, whether it's worthy of it or not. But I remember, Gene and Chris, did you both went to a conference a few years back, and you did a show from there, and I forget which one it was.
It was the UFO Congress 3 years ago.
Yeah, that sounded great as a listener, in that such and such a person was around. They'd sit down, have a chat, blah blah blah, happy to be recorded and stuff. And to be quite honest, I just don't know enough about how people act in these situations. I mean, I've no doubt that if Chris, Regine, and you two guys, Paul and Greg, at these kind of conferences, you're definitely not going to set yourselves above people looking down. But let's say...
When we did those shows, we did a couple of episodes where we featured people at the conference, and we had to go through a whole thing to get to a recording space, because they were jealously guarding the schedules. So, of course, we were doing everything on an informal basis and not planning. And so one time we started running into somebody else's time, I guess, and they were having a freak out session. How dare you? Well, the guest showed up late and this, that, and the other thing. And it kind of sours you on that because it got into an ego match. And we didn't want that. We just wanted to sit down, do our thing, and leave.
Yeah, no biggie.
Let's name names. Who are those at these kind of conferences who have a bit of an attitude problem?
Richard Hoagland.
Stephen Bassett.
He is an attitude problem.
Yeah.
Who?
It's my personal opinion that Stephen Bassett is actually a government plant. He's a disinfo agent.
Stephen Greer is another one, but he's...
Anyone who cared, supposedly, as much about ufology and disclosure or whatever, they wouldn't be so blind to the damage that someone like Paul Hellyer did when he was... at the citizens' hearing, he's just completely blind to the people who do the field no good. And I think what better positioned for a real paid disinfo agent to occupy than Stephen Bassett's position? Yeah. Honestly,
I've spent a fair amount of time, not recently, but in years past, interacting with Bassett at conferences. And while I'd love to think that he's a disinformation agent, although I don't think there are very many of those, I have absolutely no doubt that he isn't. I just think he's a really, really mean-spirited person who, uses this field partly to make money, but also I think he is a true believer too. I think he actually sort of believes some of the same things Hellyer does. But I will say
he doesn't have a BS meter, Greg.
No, I don't think he. No,
and that would be his only out to sort of debunk the theory that he's a disinformation agent. All he would have to say is, well, I accepted all his facts, so what's your problem? If that's the case, then he's an idiot, and if it's not the case, he's a very useful idiot.
When we hit him with that, why don't you do some vetting of the people you present at your conferences in one of the early episodes of the Paracast? He basically said that doesn't make a difference.
It doesn't make a difference to him, but he's trying to make a difference on the outside. And if you don't make a difference on the outside, what it's just a circle jerk.
Yeah, exactly. And if he's an aspiring politician, I think he ran for office, he doesn't have a snowball's chance in hell, because you have to have a political savvy around yourself when you assemble witnesses, experts, pundits, and researchers, that sort of thing, to end with Paul Hellyer at the Citizens Disclosure Initiative or whatever, the fake congressional hearing, as Paul, I think, very accurately stated, to end with Paul Hellyer quoting E.T. Comments verbatim from a Jim Sparks book is, I
couldn't watch.
Go back and look at Jim Sparks, or listen to Jim Sparks' show on the Paracast, and I'll tell you, it's to blow, like take a pin and blow all this wonderful gravitas that you've established over 5 days with that one 10-minute presentation at the very end of the event. To me, if I hadn't been working there, I would have gotten up and started, mouthing off, saying bullshit.
Well, how can Bassett not see that? He's intelligent.
Well, if he's not a disinformation agent, he's the Don Knotts of politics, or I don't know.
Hellyer's an interesting cat. in that he's one of mine, meaning he's a Canadian, and he points out one of the major problems that I've seen within ufology. But before I go into that just in a little detail, let me tell you my favorite, in terms of going to conferences and meeting people, if you don't do that at least once in your life, you miss moments like when Bassett turned around and slapped his ass cheek in my face and walked away. Because I was,
Whoa,
in front of me and Nick Pope and a couple of other, Don Ledger, I think, too, and other researchers, because I was trying to give him some polite advice on how maybe he shouldn't have Stephen Greer and people like that at his conferences. And he just said, "You don't know what you're talking about." Stood up, put it. It's a story I never get tired of telling. I wish I had video of that.
Oh, it's
and then I saw him
classic.
Then I saw him at the poker table 30 minutes later, losing big with what I presumed were ex-conference profits. So he's a very strange man. But Hellyer's a nut. Every Canadian knows he's a nut. Was he at one point a cabinet minister in Canada? Yes, 45 years ago.
Yeah, for what, 6 months or something?
Well, he was the Minister of National Defense for a number of years, and eventually he quit the cabinet of Pierre Trudeau over a policy matter. I've written extensively about his history. The problem is, here's the great irony in ufology. If it's Colonel Richard Weaver standing up in a military uniform and saying something you don't want to hear about Roswell, like Project Mogul, here's the explanation, then he's clearly a disinformation agent. He's lying. He's part of the government cover-up. So you would think, well, okay, ufologists are generally distrustful of authority figures, right? Wrong.
Except
they're only distrustful of authority figures when they tell them something that doesn't fit their narrative. If you put an authority figure up like Paul Hellyer, former Minister of Defense in Canada, former Deputy Prime Minister, which is, believe me, not like being Vice President. It's even more useless as a title. But, here's an authority figure. Great, because he's good for business. So there's the great irony. It's not that they're anti-authority. It's they're anti-authority telling them things that they don't want to hear. But if Paul Hellyer gets up there and says, I read Philip Corso's book and Roswell's real and aliens are talking to us and blah, 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 perfect. Absolutely. And so the late Edgar Mitchell is another one. Edgar Mitchell is not in Paul Hellyer.
Or Nick Pope.
Crazy. Sure. But, Pope's always been much more circumspect. His favorite saying is interesting if true, which is not a bad saying, actually. But, there's Mitchell, former astronaut, walked on the moon. Great. And he says things that back up your narrative. Roswell was real and all that sort of stuff. Perfect. Other astronauts come out and say, no, we never saw anything. There's nothing to this. There's no cover-up. Then they're part of the cover-up. So it all depends on what they're saying. And Hellyer's the poster child for that. You couldn't pick a better guy because he hits all their check marks. And if you don't look too closely at his actual record, you go, this is an important person. And he was. In the late 1960s, for a brief period of time in Canada, he was fairly important. Other than that, he's not important. He's no more important than any of us on the phone right now. So, and the weird thing about Hellyer is he was Minister of Defense in Canada. So he should have known if there was a secret super government cover-up, the Minister of Defense would have known. He didn't. He has never claimed, he's repeatedly said, in fact, that while a few reports came across his desk, he didn't really think much about them, and he was not involved in any conspiracy or cover-up or anything like that. So none of his knowledge, that would be interesting.
Was he serving during Shag Harbor?
Yes, he was the Minister of National Defense during Shag Harbor. I believe he was also the minister when the Stephen Michalek case.
Michalek case, yeah.
At Falcon Lake in Manitoba,
I've heard him mention that, but I've never heard his take on Shag Harbor and why he doesn't have more of an insider knowledge.
I'm not even sure if he's aware of Shag Harbor, to be perfectly honest. But that was something that was investigated by the Canadian Department of Defense. The Michalek case was actually talked about in the House of Commons. Nobody had ever done the research on that, which required you to go through all of Hansard. They're basic research things. This annoys me too. I've talked about this before, but it's like people want to talk about all sorts of crazy stuff, but they don't want to do just the basic, simple work. Nobody had ever gone and looked to see how often UFOs have been talked about in the Canadian House of Commons. Well, I'm a Canadian, so it's not that hard. All the records are at my local university library. I did it. It took a fair amount of time, but there it is. And then I published, in the 50s and 60s, I said, people actually took it seriously. They talked about it at some significant length. They asked reasonable questions. Cabinet ministers were required to respond, particularly the Michalek case. That was one that got a lot of publicity. And one of the guys who was asking the most questions was a fellow named Edward Schreier, who later became Premier of Manitoba, which is like governor, and then Governor General of Canada, which is the head of state here. No power, but an important position. So significant people. And then it all stopped really in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And I said, look, you should have looked at that because that would be an interesting thing. Why did it stop? Why did people stop asking serious questions in government at that time? And well,
it happened in the U.S. too. We saw the end of Project Blue Book. 6 months later, the starting of MUFON. The same thing happened here.
Yes, and if you're not aware of the history, you don't know why. And then, so it's the Condon Report, and then you can either go down the conspiratorial rabbit hole that it was all a plot to stop it, or you could say, well, look, no, it wasn't that, but it was still a bad sort of decision. But you kind of have to know that stuff. And so Stephen Greer claims to have briefed a former CIA director. I have actually briefed a Canadian cabinet minister on UFOs. Now, it was at a Christmas party over drinks, and I was introduced as the UFO filmmaker. And I know the guy. His name is Jeff Regan. He's now the Speaker of the House here in Canada, a very significant position. So I'm introduced as the UFO filmmaker, and I said, well, okay, I don't like that, but sure, why not? And I spent 15 minutes basically telling him what I just told you. If you think UFOs are goofy, what about Shag Harbor? That happened 2 hours from here, Jeff. The Michalek case. And by the way, in the House of Commons in the 50s and 60s, members of your party and your father was in government in the 70s, all of these people, they were interested in UFOs. Why did that stop? You should look into that if you're interested. But even if you're not interested, don't laugh at it. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, I didn't know that. I didn't know anybody had ever talked about UFOs in the House of Commons. And I said, well, you probably should. And you should go look at some
Paul.
of those questions.
Excellent, man. I'm really gratified to hear that.
Well, he was Minister of Fisheries at the time, so I don't think he had any access.
Well, still, it doesn't matter, man. This is one big giant fishing expedition, and I'm sure he could appreciate that.
Well, I did sort of mention to him, hey, there are a lot of USO cases too, underwater UFOs, and maybe they're impacting our fishing boats or something like that. And we had a nice chat and a nice laugh, and then his assistant grabbed his arm and said, we really have to go, Minister, and they dragged him on to the next person. But they gave me the card. And the assistant said, look, if you really want to follow up with this, we'd be happy to look at your best evidence film, because that's what I was doing at the time. And I never followed up because he was out of government. Shortly thereafter, there was an election, and his party lost, and they were out of government. But maybe I'll follow up now that he's back and he's Speaker of the House. Don't know. But those historical things are important, and people need to pay more attention to them and just do some basic sort of legwork. That's a useful thing to do.
Well, I agree. Greg, how about you? I mean, do you think that the gravitas question is well served with having someone like a Paul Hellyer get up and sum up 5 days of testimony with a quote from a very questionable source? And it was your standard ET. Well, you're destroying your environment. You need to, evolve outward into the cosmos, and all this kind of love and light sort of. Benevolent space brothers trying to help us solve all our problems. Where do you come down with the ill-advised use of gravitas, shall we say?
Well, I think that any publicity about people in power being interested in the UFO subject and what it may be should be addressed privately to them. So to avoid embarrassment or whatever, I don't know how to go about that. I'm not a political preacher. I think that would be the best way to do it as a quiet effort and to impress people in a high position so that they can then go on to impress others that are around them and see how that works. The problem with that is that I don't think anybody knows exactly what the deal is, where the things come from, and exactly what to do about it, which makes it kind of a non-issue politically. The second thing is I think the disclosure thing is a huge, big waste of time, because the people that are doing it, and I've said this before, the people that are leading this, the charge for it, and like Paul said, I think the only disclosure they're going to accept is the one that conforms to their preconception. And I don't think I think there's many different parts of government and many different people in it that have different beliefs about it. And so that's splintered anyway. But the thing, you can't ask for an answer from the government with the question already answered, because if the disclosure comes out, it's like, well, there is something here, we think, but we're not quite sure. And, and Roswell wasn't really they're not going to say what the disclosure people say. They're going to say, well, then it's a cover up and it's lies and disinformation.
Right. Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
I was just going to say that I think Leslie Kean has a good approach, and people could, could follow her lead.
She's naive as the day is young, but I agree, Goggs. That kind of approach could really be beneficial, I think. There is gravitas there when you have colonels and generals and, political figures state very clear, objective facts about cases without any spin or without relying on questionable sources.
A special thank you to Paul Kimball, Greg Bishop, Goggs Mackay for hanging around for a special double-length episode.
Yeah, cool. This is our record, guys. We just did over an hour for After the Paracast. Thank you so much for hanging out.
No problem.
Pleasure.
Thanks. I'm long-winded, so no worries. Happy to be here.
I am too, if you let me.
Anytime we need wind, we'll call you guys to provide it. Gene and Chris.
After the Paracast. The After the Paracast podcast with Gene Steinberg and Christopher O'Brien is an exclusive production of Making the Impossible.